Um, Acknowledge the land claims. Adoption of the agenda. Any objections? No? Good. Any disclosures of conflict of interest before we get started? No? Okay. Just make sure. How about right now? It's all yours. Hit it.
Chair, members of council, and members of the public, my name is Shander Leggett-Falvey, and I'm a resident of Niagara Falls. Thank you for your time and attention this evening. I'm a graduate of journalism print from Niagara College, a political commentator, media critic, activist, and graphic artist. My delegation is titled Risk and Omission. In the next 9.5 minutes, I will quickly review 10 points, which I believe shows that the current proposal is rife with risks and pitfalls, and that the mitigations are insufficient. I do not wish to impugn the motives of the advocates behind this proposal. The question is ultimately about the proposal itself. Will it do more harm than good? Instead of relying on my own meandering philosophies or politics to draw this inference, I've relied exclusively on the documents provided by the DEI Advisory Committee. The phrase more harm than good is drawn from page 17 of the environmental scan, which notes that an interviewed organization said they brought 2 individuals to lead diversity training, which they felt did more harm than good. They added that it felt like scolding and in some ways created more polarization among employees. I believe this serves as a useful microcosm for a much larger sociopolitical implication. The notion here is that scolding will lead to polarization. This has been true on the micro and macro. Specific advocates of this specific proposal have, in many specific cases, engaged in scoldings, hot takes on the internet. I believe this has accelerated polarization in our region, and no doubt I've been party to it. Although I cannot linger on the topic for both tact and time, the DEI 5-year plan proposal is presented by advocates who in the past, and some currently, engage in very scolding communications, and this has not been lost in the public. This is likely one reason I was motivated to approach this proposal with a skeptical perspective. Not to mention the politics. But my purpose is not to impress upon you which politics are right or wrong, but that the controversial nature itself is a potentially volatile risk, which the mitigations are simply unable to manage or contain. DEI principles do not lead from the center, they lead from the left. This is a bureaucratic praxis for critical theory, which has a well-established opposition and concerns. The consequence is an overreach by integrating otherwise neutral municipal institutions into leftist political objectives, which is, shall we say, risky. Council may be a political body, but it is your duty as members of council to make sound decisions in the interests of the organization, according to your fiduciary duties. Therefore, my delegation sets politics aside and draws attention to the clear risks, both acknowledged and otherwise. The risks as acknowledged on page 3 of the DEI action plan include insufficient resources or budget, lack of internal external buy-in, changes in council, loss in credibility, and resistance or opposition. Turning now to the community survey, we see that vaccination status is listed. I have a page out of order. There we go. As was indicated prior, I carefully reviewed the documents of the DEI 5-year plan. Quickly delving into the survey data, here is the graph of discriminations witnessed. We know that the survey data is meant to be seen as statistically significant. And our survey says, well, here are the top 10 types of discriminations experienced. I'll let your eye linger for one moment before drawing your attention in the direction you already know I'm going. Vaccination status was listed in 4th place with 24%. With 24% identifying vaccination status as their form of discrimination. Hundreds of residents wrote this into the other category of the survey, whereas the text to the right is the only acknowledgement of this finding in all the documents. There's no focus groups. The institution did not reflect on its bias in how it marginalizes its residences. Instead, it was ignored. By the time the survey was presented in the final document, there was a new top 5 with vaccine status having been deleted without a trace. One wonders if this is, put simply, fraud. But we cannot linger and must move quickly through the rest of the risks. As a side note, this is the word cloud derived from the community survey. I will draw your attention to how small the word equity is and how large the word free is. Councillor Yip, when promoting the DEI survey on the radio, said the intent behind the survey was to learn about discrimination in bias in workplaces, schools, and the general community. But was the discrimination that was reported in the survey addressed by the institution? No. Were the institution's own biases towards this group examined? No. Were there focus groups? Did anyone examine their lived experiences? No. The data was fixed around the agenda instead of the agenda being fixed around the data, which is a huge red flag. Turning now to the staff survey, I believe it is clear that there's already a lack of buy-in and perhaps the beginnings of quiet opposition. The staff survey only had a response rate of 43%. 57% did not respond. Looking closer at the data per department, we see a tale of two Niagara regions. The smaller corporate white-collar departments, who stand something to gain from moving the project forward, had a high response rate. The larger blue-collar departments, community services, public health, public works, had a response rate below average. Perhaps it is another microcosm of a larger socio-political and socio-economic context. Perhaps ain't nobody got time for that. And what time will they want to spend training just to be scolded? Page 9 of the staff report claims that frontlines operations-based staff often lack the opportunity and access to technology required to complete online surveys, meaning the survey did not even reach the target audience. Of those that it did reach, an average of 11% of staff would prefer not to disclose their race, disabilities, religion, sexuality, or gender, with religion and sexuality at 15%. More people answered prefer not to disclose to disabilities and sexuality than any specific disability or sexuality. Does this mean that a portion of staff are sending a message through the survey that they would rather not disclose their personal data? The survey results show low buy-in. The question is, why? Well, if you'll allow me to posit these additional possibilities, the data regime you are proposing is an invasion of privacy. Perhaps worse, the very proposal is frankly an insult to the dignity of your staff, that they are, at this moment, insufficient until they receive mandatory training, that they need to be trained in a highly reductive leftist critical theory, identitarian political philosophy. I think they just want to be left alone to do their jobs as professionals and not as guinea pigs of a cultural revolution imported by regional council. Here we see on page 5 of opportunities for change to make DEI training mandatory for all staff. One wonders if this will, quote, lead to resentment. Here on page 17 of opportunities for change, quote, it's really hard to force people to take training like mandatory inclusion training. It doesn't go very well. Mandatory DEI training is a clear and known risk to the organization, and Niagara Region should not commit to it tonight. The options for DEI training include unconscious bias training, microaggressions, and anti-oppression training. And if a single slide encapsulates the proposal, it is perhaps this. Data collection is viewed as important, quote, in order to track success over time and ultimately eliminate a toxic and discriminatory culture in Niagara. Equities need to be a priority for current and future council. Okay, says you. Throughout the proposal, there is a strange conflation between human resources and elected councillors. Yes, the organization has a duty to maintain what we would call safe space for its staff. No, the organization has no duty nor right over its councillors. DEI is a political philosophy. Councillors retaining their right to hold. Thank you. Councillors retain their right to hold their own unique views and should not be subject to so-called training. Opportunities for Change says it is especially important to hold councillors accountable for their views. We've seen that before. And as I'm pressing upon you, this is all politics, not human resources. What council says or does should be of no concern to anyone but the voters and the integrity commissioner. And there's a lot more where that came from. data collection, a handbook which will be used to rewrite policies, procedures, DEI charter to push the ideology upon local businesses, support for activists through community groups, mandatory training in staff and council, awards and acknowledgements for internal and external champions of DEI, and maybe even a new accountability organization. An independent organization that would take pressure off police. This would be an impartial body at the regional level that's able to hold all sectors accountable. This is a remarkable shift to civil society without even so much as asking voters. Finally, in conclusion,
Time.
I believe I have provided a useful examination to the risks associated with this proposal. As we can see from the documentation, we can add polarization and resentment to the list of risks. And looking at the mitigations, extensive communications, consistent input, developing the business case, reporting on progress, this amounts to just doubling down, and which in my view will only accelerate the polarization and resentment. Accountability is ultimately with regional council, and that is ultimately a political body. Yes, you do need non-discrimination policies, but no, DEI is not appropriate human resources or public relations policy for municipal institutions. Which brings me to conclusion of my delegate's proposal. I believe it is clear that the mitigations cannot contain the risks of this proposal, and therefore it would be irresponsible for council to proceed at this time. That said, the earnest efforts of staff should be congratulated and they should be thanked sincerely, and council should direct staff to provide a smaller and less ideologically charged alternative, which can return in 2023 to a new council who's ready to take ownership of the proposal and move it forward. The delegate's proposal is to shelve the DEI 5-year plan and come back with a sensible non-discrimination plan. Thank you. I'm available for any questions.
11